All right, so in the first video, I talked to you a little bit about what Kant has to say about the goodwill and happiness and how this compared to what Plato and Aristotle thought about goodness and happiness. Okay. But after he's said the things he has to say about the goodwill and said how the will doesn't seem to be directed towards happiness, he goes on to say, all right, we need an explanation of what the goodwill is. And he says the concept of the goodwill is concerned with duty. So in order to develop and unfold it being like the idea of a goodwill, I'll dig into the concept of duty, which contains it. So let's talk about duty. Kant thinks a person with a goodwill is a person who does what they do because it's their duty to do it. And he's going to try to explain this idea really throughout the rest of chapter 1. He thinks the idea of duty really just is the idea of a goodwill, or rather, the idea of duty helps you explain what it is the person with goodwill is aiming at. So the person with a goodwill is not aiming at happiness, or at least their will is not aiming at happiness, because the will's not good for happiness. It's not what its job is. The goodwill, or a person with a goodwill, has a will directed towards duty. And so he wants you to think about people doing what they do because it's their duty. And he says, you know, it's really easy to tell when people aren't doing their duty sometimes, especially when they're just doing the opposite of what their duty says. So when people are violating the moral law, Kant says, well, it's very easy to tell that they're not acting from a concern for duty then. And that's actually a little puzzling because it seems like you could perfectly coherently think that sometimes people do immoral things while attempting to do what the moral law says, but they just don't understand what the moral law tells them to do. That seems, at least on the surface, like a possibility. Someone tries to do the right thing, but they fail because they don't know what the right thing to do is. Because there's different ways you can fail morally. Sometimes you can fail morally by attempting to do the right thing and just failing because you just aren't good at it, right? The same way that if I try to something I definitely can't do. Yeah, if I try to hit a hole-in-one in golf, I'm going to fail. I know what it is to hit a hole-in-one in golf. I know what it looks like. I just don't know how to get from what my skills are now to an actual hole-in-one. I don't know how to get to a good drive off the tee. Right? That's one way to fail. Another way to fail is to just not get what you're supposed to be aiming at in the first place. And so to aim at the wrong thing, but successfully carry that out. So you can imagine someone who's trying to do the right thing, right? They're very morally earnest. And they have come to believe that the right thing to do in all cases is to obey whatever the authorities tell you to do. Right? No matter what, you should do what the authorities say. And then they successfully carry out that goal. They always do what they're told. Such a person would not be doing the right thing, but it's not obvious, to me anyway, that they're not acting from a concern for duty. So it's a little bit puzzling that Kant moves so quickly and says, well, those actions can't be done from duty because they're in contravention of duty. One way to fix that for Kant, and to make that not an oversight, but maybe an implicitly, or make it a claim that has a lot of implicit meaning, is you might think everyone has the ability to know what the right thing to do is. No one, if they're really trying, can fail to appreciate what the right thing to do is. This would make him very different than Aristotle, for example, who thought that some people, remember, if you're not raised right, you're not going to know what virtue is. You're not going to understand what it is. And I think as we go on, it's going to become more and more plausible that that idea, the idea that everyone has the ability to know what the moral truth is, to know what their duty is, it's going to become more and more clear that that idea is sort of in the back of Kant's head. And that one of the things Kant doesn't like about theories like Aristotle's is how unlucky some people can be morally. but we'll return to that later on. Next up, Kant's going to discuss the trickier case in his mind of people who do the right thing. Their actions are correct, but nonetheless might not be acting from duty or with a concern for duty. All right, so Kant says it is far harder to detect the difference, and that's the difference between acting for the sake of duty or not. When the action the person performs, one that is in accord with duty, is what he directly wanted to do, rather than being something he did only because it was involved in something else that he directly wanted to do. Okay, now to explain that. This is much clearer than the original German, but even that was still a little unclear. What he's going to be doing for a while, actually, all the way for that page and all the way through most of page 9, is just explaining this basic idea with a series of examples. The first example is the shopkeeper. So the shopkeeper is the action the shopkeeper performs is not overcharging people when they could get away with it. And you can imagine all sorts of situations where a shopkeeper could get away with it. I'll use the example of a shopkeeper not overcharging a little kid. Right? The little kid won't know. Like, say a little kid goes in to buy a candy bar or something from, the local convenience store, and seeing that the kid has a $10 bill with them and they're trying to buy a $1.25 candy bar, because that's what candy bars cost now, thinks, I could make $8.75 with this, but doesn't overcharge, which is what duty would say you should do. You shouldn't overcharge, just to take advantage of the little kid's ignorance. That is a case where the action is done in accordance with duty. But Kant says, of course, the shopkeeper has a reason other than duty to do that. The shopkeeper wants to maintain a reputation for behaving well, for being the kind of person who doesn't overcharge those who they can get away with overcharging. Imagine if you were a shopkeeper who had the reputation of overcharging children and tricking old people out of their money and stuff like that. You probably wouldn't get a lot of customers anymore. People wouldn't want to go to your store. So you have a reason to do the right thing. But that doesn't mean that you're doing it for the right reason. And this contrast should be familiar to us. It's the fundamental contrast that Glaucon and Adeimantus are getting at the beginning of the Republic when they talk about the difference between a reputation for justice and being just. In this case, the shopkeeper wants a reputation for justice, and as a result, playing it safe, actually does the right thing. Right? But he's clearly after the reputation, not the right action itself. And Aristotle, who demanded that virtuous actions need to be done for their own sake. The shopkeeper's not doing the virtuous thing for the sake of being virtuous or doing the right thing. He's doing the right thing to make money. So we have the shopkeeper. We also have, Kant says, 2 examples of things that everybody basically wants, that we also have a duty to do. And that is to stay alive. Right? So Kant thinks that there is a duty not to commit suicide. And to be happy. Kant thinks you have a duty to make yourself happy. He explains the duty to make yourself happy by pointing out that if you're really, really unhappy, you're going to be tempted to do bad things, one of which might be suicide, which he just says you have a duty to preserve your own life. You're not allowed to kill yourself. In those cases, he says, everybody, or rather almost everybody, wants those things. Everybody or almost everybody wants to stay alive. Everybody or almost everybody wants to be happy. And what Kant says sounds an awful lot like, if you want to be happy, you don't deserve any credit for making yourself happy. If you want to stay alive, you don't deserve any credit for not killing yourself. And that is a little weird to think about, like giving someone credit for not killing themselves. It's like, it's just sort of the normal way to be, right? It's weird to give someone credit for the normal way of being. It's like giving someone credit for waking up in the morning, like, well done, right? Of course, some people don't wake up in the morning. Some people lie in bed all day. But we don't tend to give credit for people, or esteem, as the word Kant uses, for people who get up out of bed. And similarly, you might think it's weird to give esteem for not killing yourself. But Kant comes up with a case where it would make sense. And that's where you actually did lose the desire to live, where you lost the desire to make yourself happy. If you're like a really cold-hearted person who only wants to do what is like necessary and you have no concern for your own pleasures, Kant thinks a person who overcomes a lack of desire for life or happiness, he sounds like he's saying they're the only ones who deserve any credit for it. This has caused a lot of debate. He uses another example of people who give to charity, people who help out others. If you like helping them out, if you take pleasure in it, Kant thinks, the language he uses, at least in the translation that I remember, might not be the language in the translation you're reading. The language he uses is, such people deserve praise, people who do the right thing because it gives them pleasure, but not esteem. They don't get any moral credit for it. And this does seem, like if that's really what he means, this is a really big disagreement with Plato and Aristotle, really. Both Plato and Aristotle thought it was vital to sort of train your emotional responses so that you had the right emotional reactions to things. This was alluded to in Plato, that the reason had to govern thumos. But in Aristotle, it's absolutely central. It's the explanation for why young people can't do, or it's part of the explanation, rather, for why people who were brought up wrong, people who were sort of miseducated as young people, who were taught to take pleasure in the wrong kinds of things, can't ever be fully virtuous. For Aristotle, to be fully virtuous is to do the right thing for its own sake and get pleasure for it. And it sounds like what Kant is saying, is that if you do the right thing and get pleasure for it, then you can't be morally worthy for doing that, which means you don't have a good will, because a good will is always morally worthy. So there's this question. It's a question of interpretation, but it gets at a more important question about what we should really think about this issue. Does taking pleasure in something, does enjoying doing the right thing mean you're not doing it for the right reason? And there is an interpretation of Kant out there which says Kant was just not being all that careful. What they end up saying is, here's what's really true. And I think this interpretation is right, by the way. The interpretation I'm about to present you. They'll say, here's what Kant really meant. Kant really meant that in cases where you take pleasure in doing the right thing, you can't know that you've done it for the right reason. Because here's what seems perfectly psychologically possible, and if Kant denies this, then it's like a strike against his view. Here's what seems possible: that you can have more than one motivation for doing something. You can have a motivation that is, oh, that's nice, I like that, and also a motivation that is, that's the right thing to do, I'm going to do it because it's the right thing to do. So imagine you're the kind of person who enjoys helping those less fortunate than yourself. Right, you go to soup kitchens, and while you're serving the food to the people and you're washing the dishes and stuff like that, you get a real feeling of joy, right? It seems like it's perfectly possible for you to have multiple motivations for that, to be doing it because it's the right thing and because you enjoy it. It also seems entirely possible that you enjoy it, but you don't have any motivation to seek out that pleasure. That would be a little weird. Like once you know that you enjoyed, it would be a little weird if there wasn't like a part of you that said, oh, that'll be fun. Let's do that, right? But here's what certainly seems possible. You can have both. If you have both, then it seems like you have a good will because you're doing it because it's the right thing to do. And in addition, you have a pleasant disposition, right? A set of desires that make it easier for you to do the right thing. But in that case, you would have to say that you don't know for sure about yourself that your moral motivation would be strong enough in the absence of the pleasure you get from it to make you do the right thing. So let's say you're the kind of person who enjoys going to help people at the soup kitchen and you think it's your moral duty. What Kant thinks is you're not in a position to know that that your moral motivation is strong enough. You don't know that if you lose all that pleasure you take in helping other people, you don't know that you'll keep it up, right? For all you know, Your moral motivation, while present, is weak, not strong enough to actually make you sacrifice your own time to help others. And so it's only in the case of the person who actually doesn't enjoy helping others that we can be absolutely sure that they're doing it for the right reason. Kant says, for the first time it shines through the moral worth of their will. But that doesn't actually say that if you enjoy doing the right thing, then you can't be doing it for the right reasons. It just says you can't know, right? There's a difference between something being the case and our being able to know it, right? There's all sorts of things that are true that we can't know. We have no idea how many stars are around, or how many planets are around the median-sized star in the Andromeda galaxy, right? There's a fact about that, right? There's some number. Could be 0, could be 1, could be 30. Who knows? That's a fact. We are not in a position to know that fact. We'll probably never really be in a position to know that fact. But it's important to keep an eye on the difference between those two things. Something's being the case as opposed to our ability to know that it's the case. And I think the best interpretation of Kant in this passage that comes around page 8 and 9 on your translation, is that he's saying we can't know for sure that you have a morally good will. So that's the interpretation I think is correct. I do want to tell you about the other interpretation. The other interpretation says that we only have moral virtue if we've had to overcome our own nature to get it. Right? That moral virtue needs to be a kind of accomplishment. It needs to be a kind of self-conquest, right? So that if you find yourself with the natural desires to help other people, you never have to overcome those bad desires, because you don't have the bad desires. And as a result, you never actually get virtue. I'm going to relate it to a quote that you see a lot, and it's frankly kind of annoying because it's become kind of a cliche, but it does get at a point. That you've probably heard people say, adversity doesn't forge character, it reveals it. I'm suggesting that the best interpretation of Kant is that one, right? That adversity reveals the character you already have. It doesn't give you the character, right, that you have. But there is a way of interpreting Kant where it's only the struggle against yourself that produces the moral virtue. That moral virtue is impossible to get any other way. That's a controversy about this passage. I've let you know what the controversy is. I think it gets at an important issue in thinking about what being a good person amounts to. But I'm going to leave it aside without going all that much more in depth. I could go really in depth. I've read like a dozen articles on this topic alone, and I think there are hundreds in print. The last thing I want to get to in this video, before we get to the 3 propositions that the first book or first chapter of the Groundwork is sort of built around, is this comment about love, because it provides us a clue to why Plato seems to be taking these positions that are diametrically opposed to Aristotle's on the relationship between being a good person and having certain kinds of emotional reactions. He says, no doubt, this is how we should understand the scriptural passages that command us to love our neighbor and even our enemy. We can't be commanded to feel love for someone or to simply prefer that he thrive. There are 2 sorts of love: practical love that lies in the will and in principles of action, and pathological love that lies in the direction the person's feelings and tender sympathies take. The latter of these cannot be commanded, but the former can be. And that is a command to do good to others from duty, even when you don't want to or like doing it, and indeed, even when you are naturally and unconquerably hate doing it. So what's going on there is Kant is pointing out that there's a difference between sort of acting like you love someone and actually feeling love toward them. And he says you can be commanded to act that way. You can be commanded to take the actions that a loving person would, but you can't be commanded to feel love. Why? Well, because it's not really in your control. It's not something that is determined by your will. Your feelings aren't controlled by your decisions. You can't just decide to feel things. If you're sad, you can't just decide to feel good. That's not the way that works. If it was, nobody would ever feel sad, right? Nobody likes feeling sad. I mean, maybe some emo kids like feeling sad, but for the most part, people don't like feeling sad. People would just decide to feel a different way, but that's not how it works. And Kant says, well, if you take the command in the Bible to love your neighbor at face value, it looks like it's telling you to do something that's not in your control. Now, I want to be clear here. It's not the case that the Bible is telling you to do something you can't do. Because, of course, if you already love your neighbor, then of course you can do it. You're actually doing it, so you can do it. But if you don't love your neighbor, there's nothing you can do to feel love for them. You can't make yourself love them if you already don't. That's Kant's idea. Your will does not control whether you feel love or whether you have what he calls pathological love. Pathological there does not mean what like the contemporary connotation suggests, which is like there's something deeply wrong with it. It just means having to do with feelings. It's not that the Bible is commanding you to do something you can't do. It's that the Bible is commanding you to do something that you don't have control over. Which means if you fail to do it, then you couldn't have done it. Right? So people who do love their neighbor, they can do it, obviously, because they are doing it. But the people who can't, who aren't rather loving their neighbor, are not going to be able to make themselves love their neighbor, at least not right away. Maybe they can train themselves to do it. Maybe they can go through the process that Aristotle suggests, where you habituate yourself into doing it. But even Aristotle seems to think there's a certain point after which habituation is not going to do any good. What Kant is endorsing here is a principle called ought implies can. What that means is, if you ought to do X, then you must be able to do X. This principle is central to Kant's whole thinking about morality. It seems to be denied in Aristotle. Aristotle doesn't think the virtues stop being what you should do just because you were raised improperly and so are unable to be virtuous. He just seems to think, well, tough luck, right? Being virtuous is still the best way to be. Some people, through bad luck in their parents or their environment or things like that, are cut off from being able to achieve the highest level of virtue. And that's just how it goes. Right? But for Kant, that's not going to be okay. Kant's going to say if you can't do something, then it doesn't make sense to say that you ought to do it. And this principle, it motivates quite a bit of what Kant has to say. It is why control, the ability to do anything that morality might command, is going to end up being so important to Kant. He's going to talk a lot about free will and things like that towards the end of this book. And the reason is that he accepts this principle. Some people claim this principle is obviously true. I've listened to talks given before where people say this is just a fundamental truth about morality, right? Everyone accepts it. And I'm sitting there thinking, well, I don't accept it. I don't think ought implies can is true. But I will say it is one of those principles that is so widely accepted that a lot of people who believe it don't think it needs any demonstration. They don't think it needs any evidence brought up in favor of it because it just seems to them so blindingly obvious. It probably seems blindingly obvious to you. After all, a principle like this would explain why it's absurd to make certain kinds of demands of people, right? So if there's somebody falling from the sky, right, they get pushed out of an airplane or something like that, and you're there on the ground and someone turns to you and says, go save them. And you're like, what do you mean go save them? And they're like, you should go save them. You have a duty to go save them. And you might be like, well, I can't. So, I mean, what am I supposed to do? There it makes sense to explain the fact that you don't have an obligation to save that person who's falling from a plane because you can't. Pretty much everybody accepts that. But that is an inability that like all human beings share and no human beings can fly. It's an inability that has to do with like just what your body is capable of. It does not have to do with this kind of thing that Kant's talking about here, which is something about your mind. Right? If you don't love someone, that's a fact about your mind, your emotions, things like that. It's not a fact that about your body, right? Or like, it's not a fact about the human body in general, right? No human body can fly. Plenty of human people can love lots of others, right? So there are clear cases where ought implies can seems to work, right? You can't demand that someone do something that like is just completely beyond human ability. But that's a little bit different than saying you can't demand of someone you can't demand of someone that they do something which they are somehow unable to do, right? To give an example that might put a little pressure on ought implies can, suppose someone has a kid, right? They're a parent. And what we ordinarily think about parents is they have certain obligations to their children, obligations to provide them a safe home, obligations to provide them, the food they need, medicine they need, clothing, stuff like that. And in some cases, people can get into a situation where they just can't do it, right? If you are, you have kids, but you're very, very poor and you can't provide them with medicine, no one thinks you're a bad parent because of that, right? Especially if the reason you're poor isn't that you're lazy. The reason you're poor is just like you work really hard. It's just there's no good jobs where you live and you don't have the money to relocate. Then nobody except like really stupid people are going to say, oh, you're a failure as a parent because you're not providing your child with what they need. It's like, well, I can't. But then change the example a little bit. Say that you have a child and you're also just really lazy. You've been lazy your whole life, right? You were indulged in your laziness. Your parents allowed you to be lazy whenever you didn't work at something. They were like, oh, okay, you should really work harder, but that's as far as it went. And so you develop this laziness over time. And so you are lazy, and that's the reason you're poor, right? Most people are not poor for this reason. I've actually never met someone. I've met poor people. I've been poor myself. I've never met a poor person who was poor because of laziness. I'm sure they exist. Just never met one myself, and I've known quite a few people who are not well off. But it happens somewhere. There's like millions of poor people. Some of them have to be lazy. Suppose that someone is not providing their kids with a safe home. They're not providing their kids with enough food. They're not providing their kids with medical care when they need it. And you go to them and you say, what's the problem? And they're like, well, I can't do those things. And you're like, oh, well, why not? What's wrong? And they say, well, I got no money. You say, oh, well, why don't you have any money? And they're like, well, I can't keep a job. And they're like, and you're thinking like, is there some kind of problem? And they're like, no, I just don't work because I don't like it. And then you say, well, then just do it. And they're like, well, I can't anymore. I'm too lazy now, right? I can't make myself not lazy like that. And that seems true, right? You develop certain habits. You can't just get rid of the habits all at once. But are we really going to say that person no longer has an obligation to provide for their children because they're lazy? Right? Can having a moral vice be a reason why you don't have obligations to do the right thing anymore? So I just want to point this out because this is a fundamental principle for Kant. It is in certain contexts extremely plausible, but it might be worth thinking about whether there are any contexts like the one I just provided where maybe it's not as plausible. And I also want to point out it doesn't seem to be a principle that our earlier ancient authors accepted. All right, next we're going to, and this will be in the next video, we're going to go to this section here where he lays out the 3 propositions about duty.